On today's episode of Holy or Heresy, we're going to be talking about the War of Independence. We're actually going to be reading the entirety of the Declaration of Independence because most people haven't. And I think it's a pretty good idea to actually read it if you're an American. But before we do that, let me just give you some scriptures that should help us on this issue. Romans chapter 13, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those which exist have been appointed by God. And it goes on to say that it is a minister of God to you for good. It does not bear the sword in vain, so it's necessary to be in subjection, and this is why you pay taxes and so on, right? We also see in Acts chapter 5, Peter and the apostles answered and said, we must obey God rather than men. Romans 13, subject yourself to the government. However, Acts chapter 5, when there's people in authority over you, you are still supposed to obey God over them. There's the law of God, and then there is the law of man, and there is no such law of man that can usurp the law of God. We also see in Deuteronomy 17 towards the end, this is talking about specifically the kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament, obviously, but now the king is supposed to write a copy of the law in the presence of the Levites, and he's going to read the law all the days of his life so he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, to carefully observe all the words of this law and these statutes. As a side note, I believe that every governor, every senator, congressman, president, literally everyone in the United States, they should be experts in the law of God, right? If they want to come up with their own laws for this country, who better to learn from than God? Right? The world would be a much better place if people wanted to learn the law of God and by God's grace uphold the law. No, the law does not save us, only grace does. Grace actually empowers us to love God's law. That his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he may prolong his days in the kingdom, he and his sons in the midst of Israel. So here's the king. God is still above him, right? God is the king of all the kings out there. Jesus is the King of Kings. If there is a king out there who is not acting righteously, the implication here is that God is not going to prolong his days. Bad things are going to happen to that king, and there are means to that end. We see in Isaiah chapter 10, woe to those who enact evil statutes, and to those who constantly record mischief, so as to turn the poor away from their cause, and rob the afflicted of my people of their justice, so that widows may be their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans. One example of God not allowing a king to live long in the land is in Judges chapter 3, when Israel was not being obedient, and so Yahweh strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So Israel being evil, God has this king of Moab to come in and take over Israel and struck Israel. And so they served him for 18 years. Then the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh raised up a savior for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, left-handed man. Now he made himself a sword which had 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. Now he came to the king and said, I have a message from God for you. Then he sent forth his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. By the way, the king was a very fat man. That's what it says. So he put the sword into his belly, and the handle also went in after the blade, and the fat coat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the refuse came out. This is how the Bible describes God saving Israel. Here's a man coming to kill the king in a brutal fashion. I bring this up because there is this idea that Christians should be pacifists. We should never support any violence whatsoever for any reason, and that's just not biblical. God saves people by raising up people to kill other people sometimes. We also see in Luke 22, talking to the disciples, whoever has a money belt is to take it along, likewise also a bag, and whoever has no sword should sell his garment and buy one. There's that word should. It's not optional. This is a commandment. There are certain scenarios where the sword should be used by people. We know that the government should not bear the sword in vain, but in very specific circumstances, your average citizen should bear their swords as well. Now, let's move on to the Declaration of Independence. Is this declaration biblically justified? Let's check it out. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth to separate an equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. This is very formal language, of course, but basically there is is a God out there, and the idea is that there is certain inherent rights that every single human has because God has given them those rights, and that they feel the need to explain themselves. We should declare the causes, the reasons for why we want to separate. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So the idea here is that we're not going to separate because of some ridiculous, trivial matter. It would be ridiculous for Texas to want to separate from the rest of the country because Texas has better barbecue, and we don't want to associate with people who can't cook very well. That would be absurd. And even just like taxes, right? You're taxing us too much, therefore we're going to separate. That's not valid. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to the candid world. By the way, this was commonly believed in the English world back then. If there is a king and he goes against the Constitution and he becomes tyrannical, that king is no longer king. He has given up his authority to rule over the people because it's a contract. Here's this king who's allowed to do this, and here's the people who willfully submit to this king in this scenario. Now, if this king breaks this, then this king is no longer a legitimate king. And so it was completely understood that the king isn't really a king if he's not acting in accordance with the Constitution. So back to Romans chapter 13 real quick. Every person is to be subjection to the governing authorities. What if your governing authority says, it's okay to rebel against the government if the government does this thing and starts acting tyrannical? I think it's pretty obvious. The answer is yes. You're perfectly just in rebelling. Not as one single person, but as a whole, 13 colonies, right? These are 13 states, governments of their own. And so it basically gets to a point where you're simply defending your own citizens from outside influence, criminal activity from the king. But this is what they said. The king, King George III, he has refused to assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriation of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. giving his assent to their act's pretended legislation, for courting large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of a trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. If you guys aren't getting the picture, this is very obviously tyrannical activity, evil activity, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. This one right here is key, guys. Abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection. If the king himself says, "You're not my subject anymore," you're not under his authority, okay? Biblically, what do we have here? Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. If your governing authority says, "You do not have my protection anymore," that governing authority is not your governing authority. You have someone else. And if you're a citizen in the 13 colonies at that time, your governing authority, the one who is highest above you, besides God, of course, would be those rulers in your area in the 13 colonies, okay? So, biblically speaking, they actually were independent from England before the Declaration of Independence, okay? He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. This is also key as well, the very peaceful attempts to solve these issues prior to the Declaration of Independence and the war, right? Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, basically their generosity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity, which is common ancestry. Like, seriously, we're brothers, like we are of the same blood. Come on now. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. This might be my favorite line in the entire document, but we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So in conclusion, was this holy or heresy? Well, we could dig a little bit deeper on the theology of this document, but I don't think that's needed. The answer is holy. What else are you supposed to do? This would be like if the federal government of the United States was becoming more and more tyrannical, and then Texas wanted to protect their own citizens. They wanted to keep their own land to serve God, basically. Now, obviously, this does not mean that all the people on this side of the war, they were all the good people and everyone else was evil. No, it's a lot more complex than that. Now, as a side note, I do believe that a lot of the people back then would have viewed today's federal government as pretty tyrannical as well. But at the end of the day, though, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. God help us all.